There is a mountain in central Italy called Monte Morone. It rises above the Abruzzo Valley like something that was placed there deliberately steep, quiet, and different to the cities below. In the 13th century, if you wanted to disappear from the world, this is where you went. The hermits who climbed it did not go there to find anything. They went there to stop being found. In the summer of 1294, a man named Pietro di Morrone was living in a cave near the top of that mountain. He was 84 years old. He had been a monk since he was 17. He had founded an order, built monasteries, survived 2 papacies, outlived his enemies, and eventually retreated so far from the world that the world had largely forgotten he existed. He was, by every account, content. He fasted every day except Sunday. He slept on the ground. He wore a chain of iron around his body. He prayed through the night and worked through the day and asked for nothing except to be left alone with his God and his silence. He did not want power. He had never wanted power. This is the most important thing to understand about what happens next, and also the most important thing that the people who needed him never bothered to consider. In July of 1294, a group of soldiers and church officials began climbing that mountain. They carried with them a letter. The letter told Pietro di Morrone that the College of Cardinals, after 27 months of deadlock, had elected him Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. He wept when he read it. Not from joy. He wept because he knew in the way that very old men who have spent 60 years in silence know things that this was not a gift. He wept because somewhere far below that mountain, in the halls of palaces he had never visited, men who had never met him had decided that he was exactly what they needed, not who he was. What he was, the symbol of him, the prophecy of him, and he was right to weep. Because what followed was not a papacy. It was a demonstration precise, brutal, and entirely deliberate of what happens when a political system learns to use holiness as a weapon. When the men who cannot agree on a leader discover that the easiest solution is not to find a leader at all, but to find a prophecy, dress it in white robes, and place it on a throne. Pietro di Morrone descended that mountain. He took the name Celestine V. He reigned for 5 months. He made more consequential mistakes in those 5 months than most popes manage in a lifetime. And then he resigned, the first pope in centuries to resign in a way later remembered as voluntary abdication, and was kept under supervision by his successor, where he died 10 months later. Dante Alighieri placed him at the gates of hell. The man who imprisoned him, Boniface VIII, Dante placed much deeper. This is the story of a prophecy that was not really a prophecy, of an election that was an election shaped by factional deadlock and prophetic expectation, of a holy man who was used as a tool by people who understood something that he did not, that in a world where power is disputed, the most powerful thing is not an argument. It is a narrative. And the narrative they needed, the one they had been building for over a century before Pietro di Morrone ever climbed that mountain, was very simple. A holy man will come. He will be humble. He will be pure. He will reform the church and usher in the age of the Spirit. He is already written. He is already chosen. All you have to do is recognize him. This is how misinformation works when it wears the face of prophecy. Not with a lie you can disprove, with a truth you desperately want to believe. Pope Nicholas IV died on April 4th. 1292. He died in Rome, in the middle of a political situation that had no clean resolution, leaving behind an institution that had spent the better part of 3 decades accumulating enemies faster than it could manage them. He was not a great pope. He was not a terrible pope. He was, in the way of many men who hold positions larger than their abilities, a pope who had been placed in an impossible situation by forces that preceded him, and who had done his best. and whose best had not been nearly sufficient. He died, and the throne of St. Peter became empty. This was not unusual. Popes died, conclaves were called, a new pope was elected. The machinery of the church, which had been running for over 1,000 years through plague and schism and the occasional anti-pope, was designed to handle succession. It had done so before. It would do so again. What it was not designed to handle, what no institution is designed to handle, was a college of cardinals that had split so completely along factional lines that the mere act of being in the same room together had become a form of mutual hostage-taking. In 1292, the College of Cardinals consisted of 12 men. 12. The Roman Catholic Church, the largest religious institution in the Western world. The spiritual authority over tens of millions of people. The political power that could crown kings and excommunicate emperors had reduced its entire leadership succession to 12 men. And those 12 men were divided, almost perfectly, into two camps. On one side, the Colonna family, ancient Roman nobility, enormously wealthy, politically connected to the Holy Roman Emperor and the nobility of central Italy. They had placed cardinals in the college for generations, and they intended to place a pope on the throne, or, failing that, to ensure that no one else did. On the other side, the Orsini family, equally ancient, equally wealthy, equally convinced that the papacy belonged to them by right of history and blood. Between them, the papal throne, empty. The conclave opened in Perugia in the spring of 1292. It did not end in the spring of 1292. It did not end in the summer of 1292. It did not end in the fall of 1292, or the winter, or the following spring. The cardinals met and argued and voted and failed to reach the required majority and adjourned and met again. The heat of the Italian summer turned the conclave into something closer to a siege. 2 of the 12 cardinals died during the proceedings, reducing the college to 10, and doing nothing to break the deadlock. Because the men who died were not the men whose intransigence was the problem. By the end of 1293, the Holy See had been vacant for over 18 months. This was not merely an ecclesiastical problem. This was a political crisis of the first order. Consider what the papacy was. In the 13th century, it was not a purely spiritual office. It was a temporal power with territories, armies, treaties, and tax revenues. It was the authority that validated the crowns of kings and could remove them. It was the institution that called crusades, mediated between warring states, and maintained the legal framework of Christian Europe. Without a pope, this machinery did not simply pause. It began to deteriorate. Decisions went unmade. Disputes went unresolved. The enemies of the church and the church had many watched the empty throne with considerable interest. The cardinals, meanwhile, continued to vote and to fail. Here's the part that tends to get lost in the official histories. The deadlock was not simply a matter of personal ambition, though there was plenty of that. It was structural. The Colonna and Orsini factions were not arguing about who was most qualified to be pope. They were arguing about which family would control the pope. A candidate supported by the Colonna was unacceptable to the Orsini, not because of anything that candidate believed or had done, but because a pope in debt to the Colonna was a pope who would make decisions favorable to the Colonna, and vice versa. This is what the vacancy was really about, not the absence of a leader, the inability to agree on whose instrument the leader would be. What they needed and what they would eventually find was not a compromise candidate. Compromise candidates had been tried. They were rejected by whichever faction felt they were slightly less advantageous. What they needed was something more clever than a compromise. They needed a candidate who appeared to belong to no faction at all. A candidate so removed from the political world that he could be presented as standing above it. A candidate whose holiness was beyond dispute, whose poverty was genuine, whose distance from Rome was so complete that he could be plausibly claimed to be independent of both families. A candidate, in other words, who could be controlled precisely because he had no idea how to be controlling. But finding such a candidate, and more importantly, finding one that both factions would accept, required something more than negotiation. It required a story. And the story, as it turned out, had been under construction for a very long time. Malaria swept through Perugia in the summer of 1292. 2 cardinals died. The survivors, already weakened by months of confined argument, began to reconsider the terms of their impasse, not out of any sudden burst of statesmanship, but out of the more immediate fear of dying without having accomplished anything. The Italian summer was not designed for consensus. It was designed for heat and disease and the kind of slow, grinding desperation that makes men do things they would not otherwise consider. By the spring of 1294, 27 months had passed since Nicholas IV's death. 27 months. To put this in context, the previous longest vacancy in papal history had been 3 years. Following the death of Clement IV in 1268, a vacancy so scandalous that it prompted the introduction of the conclave system in the first place, locking the cardinals in together and reducing their food supply until they produced a pope. The conclave at Perugia had been operating under a modified version of these rules. It had not worked. The cardinals were exhausted. They were frightened. They were in the way of men who have been arguing for over 2 years about something that should have taken 2 weeks, beginning to understand that the problem was not solvable by the methods they had been using. And then, into this exhaustion and this fear, a letter arrived. Or more precisely, a letter was said to have arrived. The distinction matters. We will return to it. The letter was attributed to Pietro di Morrone, the hermit monk of Monte Morrone, the founder of the Celestine order, the man who had spent decades climbing further and further away from the world. According to the accounts that circulated after the election, Pietro had written to warn the cardinals that if they did not elect a pope soon, God would punish them severely for their negligence. Cardinal Latin Orsini, yes. And Orsini stood before the conclave and announced that a holy hermit had received a divine revelation, that God had spoken, that the delay must end. The conclave, 27 months of failure compacted into a single moment of collective exhaustion, voted unanimously. Pietro di Morrone was elected pope. This is the story as it is usually told. Here is what the story leaves out. Pietro di Morrone did not appear from nowhere in 1294. He had been a figure of considerable religious importance for decades. His Celestine order had spread across central and southern Italy, numbering 36 monasteries and more than 600 monks. He had been to Rome. He had navigated papal politics before successfully. By maintaining the appearance of being above them, he had secured Charles I of Anjou, King of Naples, as the protector of his order. He had built a basilica that had become a major pilgrimage site. He was not simply a hermit. He was a hermit with an institutional base, a royal patron, and a reputation for holiness that had been carefully, if not necessarily cynically, cultivated over a lifetime. And the spiritual, the radical Franciscan movement that had been arguing for decades that the Church needed to return to apostolic poverty, had been watching him for years. For the spirituals, Pietro di Morrone was not just a holy man. He was a prophecy made flesh. To understand what happened to Pietro di Morrone, He must first understand what people in the 13th century believed was coming, not what they feared, not what they hoped for, what they believed with the absolute, structuring certainty of people for whom the sacred and the political were not separate categories but a single continuous reality was already written, already determined, already moving toward them through history like a tide that no human decision could redirect. They believed the world was ending, not immediately, not in the way of panicked millennialism, though there was plenty of that too, but in the deeper, more organized, more intellectually rigorous sense that the greatest theological minds of this century had been developing for decades. That history had a shape, that the shape was tripartite, and that they were living in the third and final movement of a divine symphony whose conclusion had already been composed. The man who gave this belief its most coherent and most dangerous form was a Calabrian abbot named Joachim of Fiore. Joachim died in 9202. He had spent his life doing something that most people in his position respected. Patronized by popes, protected by the church would have been wise not to do. He had looked at the whole of human history and tried to find the pattern underneath it. What he found, or what he believed he found, which in this context amounts to the same thing, was a structure of 3 ages, corresponding to the 3 persons of the Trinity. The age of the Father, the time of the Old Testament, law, obedience, the letter of the covenant. This age was complete. The age of the Son, the time of the Church as it currently existed. Institution, hierarchy, sacrament. This age was ending. The age of the Spirit, or was coming. A new era in which the institutional church, with its wealth, its corruption, its political entanglements, its lawyers and its armies, would give way to a more direct relationship between humanity and God. An age of monks and contemplatives, an age of poverty and spiritual freedom, an age in which the Holy Spirit would move directly through consecrated men, without the mediating apparatus of a corrupt ecclesiastical bureaucracy. Joachim himself was careful. He did not say the church would be destroyed. He said it would be transformed. He submitted all his writings to papal examination before he died. He did not claim to be a prophet. He said he had been given the gift of spiritual understanding, the ability to read the pattern that was already there. The men who came after him were considerably less careful. Within decades of Joachim's death, his ideas had spread through the Franciscan order like water through limestone, slowly, invisibly, and with the kind of erosive force that only becomes visible when the ground starts to collapse. The spiritual Franciscans, the radical wing of the order that Francis of Assisi himself had founded, took Joachim's 3 ages and built a political theology on top of them. They were not simply monks arguing about poverty. They were men who believed, with complete sincerity, that the corrupt institutional church was the obstacle standing between humanity and the Third Age, and that the Third Age was not coming someday. It was coming now. They had a date. Joachim had calculated, based on his reading of Revelation, that the transition would occur around 1260. When 1260 passed without visible transformation, the spirituals did not abandon the framework. They adjusted it. The date was symbolic, not literal. The point was the direction of history, not the precise moment of arrival. What they needed, what every movement that believes history is moving in its favor eventually needs, was a sign, not an argument, not a theological demonstration. A figure, a person, someone who embodied the transition so completely that their mere existence was evidence that the age of the Spirit had begun. They called this figure the Pastor Angelicus, the Angelic Pope. The concept of the Angelic Pope was not a single text or a single prophecy. It was a cluster of expectations, some genuinely ancient, some recently fabricated, all thoroughly entangled with each other by the time the 13th century reached its final decade. The core expectation was simple. Before the final transformation of the Church, a pope would emerge who was unlike all the popes who had come before him. He would be humble where they had been proud, poor where they had been wealthy, spiritual where they had been political. He would not come from the great families of Rome. He would not be a lawyer or a diplomat or a cardinal who had spent decades accumulating influence. He would come, as it were, from outside the system entirely. He would be, in the precise sense that the spirituals meant the word, an angel in human form, not supernatural but so thoroughly removed from the corruptions of the world that he seemed to belong to a different order of being. This expectation had genuine ancient roots. The idea that God would intervene to reform the Church through an unexpected holy figure ran through centuries of Christian thought. What the 13th century did, what Joachimite thinking made possible, was give this vague expectation a specific historical location. The Angelic Pope was not a timeless hope. He was a scheduled event. He was coming soon. The signs were visible. All you had to do was know how to read them. And reading signs, in the 13th century, was a serious business. In the decades following Joachim's death, a literature began to accumulate around his ideas that he had not written and would not have recognized. This is the mechanism that tends to get overlooked in histories, focused on individual actors and individual decisions. Joachim of Fiore was a careful, disciplined thinker who explicitly refused the title of prophet. What he left behind was a method of reading history, a framework so powerful and so flexible that it could be applied to almost any situation, and so clearly pointing toward transformation that anyone who wanted to claim they were part of that transformation could plausibly do so. Into this framework, texts began to appear. The most important of these, for the events of 1294, was a collection called the Vatitinia de Summis Pontificibus, the prophecies of the Supreme Pontiffs. It was a set of illustrated papal prophecies, each one pairing a cryptic image with a short Latin text, purporting to predict the character and fate of future popes. It was attributed, at various points, to Joachim of Fiore himself. He did not write it. Scholars now are certain of this. The text shows none of the characteristics of Joachim's genuine writings and contradicts his explicit statements about the limits of prophetic knowledge in several key respects. But in the 13th century, attribution was a tool, not a fact. If you wanted your text to be taken seriously, if you wanted the weight of a century of theological development and Franciscan radicalism to stand behind your words, you attributed it to Joachim. And the Vaticinia was taken very seriously. The Yale Beinecke Library holds a 14th century copy of the text beautifully illuminated, clearly considered important enough to produce with considerable expense and care. The images in the manuscript correspond to individual popes, each one a portrait not of who the pope actually was, but of what role he was destined to play in the unfolding divine drama. Some images are ominous, some suggest reform, some suggest catastrophe. The one that mattered, in the summer of 1294, was the image associated with the next pope in sequence. It showed a figure of conspicuous holiness, simple robe, a posture of humility, the iconographic vocabulary of a saint, not a sovereign. This is the context into which Pietro di Morrone's election was placed. Not by Pietro himself. He had no interest in prophetic politics, and the evidence suggests he found the entire Joachimite framework deeply uncomfortable. But by the people who needed his election to mean something, by the spirituals who had been waiting for the Angelic Pope for decades, by the political factions who needed a candidate whose holiness was beyond dispute, by the chroniclers who, in the days and weeks after the conclave, began writing the story of what had just happened. In their telling, the telling that spread through Italy with astonishing speed, the telling that drew 200,000 people to his coronation, Pietro di Morrone was not simply a new pope. He was the fulfillment of a prophecy that had been accumulating for a century. He was the Angelic Pope. He was the first legitimate leader of the Church since the corruption of the donation of Constantine. He was the beginning of the age of the Spirit. He was, in short, a narrative. And the people who constructed that narrative had very specific needs that Pietro di Morrone, the actual human being sitting in his cave on Monte Morone, had not been consulted about. Here is what is important to understand about the Angelic Pope prophecy, and about the Vaticinio de Summis Pontificibus, and about the entire Joachimite framework that surrounded Pietro di Morrone's election like a stage set around an unwitting actor. None of it was coordinated. This is the point that tends to produce the most resistance, because the story, told simply, sounds like a conspiracy. A group of powerful men needed a candidate. A prophetic tradition existed that described exactly such a candidate. The candidate was found and elected. Therefore, conspiracy. But the reality is both more complex and more disturbing than a conspiracy. What existed? 1294 was not a plan. It was a culture, a shared set of expectations, a common vocabulary of symbols and signs, a widespread agreement about the shape of history and the direction in which it was moving. The spirituals who believed Pietro was the Angelic Pope were not, for the most part, cynically manipulating the useful symbol. They genuinely believed it. The cardinals who voted for him were not, for the most part, executing a previously agreed-upon strategy. They were exhausted, frightened men reaching for the only solution that seemed to satisfy everyone. The cultures can be more effective than conspiracies, precisely because they do not require coordination to produce coordinated results. When everyone in a room shares the same expectations about what a leader should look like, humble, holy, outside the system, untouched by the corruptions of politics, then the search for a leader will inevitably tend toward a particular type of person. Not because anyone planned it, because the shared expectations shaped the search. The Vaticinio, the Joachimite framework, the Angelic Pope narrative. These were not weapons that someone decided to pick up and use in 1294. They were the water in which everyone was already swimming. They determined what counted as a solution before anyone began looking for one. This is the mechanism, not the lie that is told. The expectation that is cultivated slowly, over years, over decades, until the moment arrives when the expectation and the need align perfectly. And the prophecy writes itself. There is one more element of the prophetic context that requires attention before we turn to the election itself, because it connects the events of 1294 to a pattern that will reappear, in slightly different form. 296 years later, among the texts circulating under Joachim of Fiore's name in the late 13th century, there was a tradition of what scholars now call papal prophecy short, cryptic descriptions of future popes, each one linked to a symbol or motto that could be applied, with varying degrees of ingenuity, to the actual characteristics of the pope in question. The Vaticinio de Summis Pontificibus was the most elaborate version of this tradition, but it was not the last. In 1595, a Benedictine monk named Arnold Wian published a text he attributed to St. Malachy, an Irish archbishop who had died in 1148. The text, Wian said, had been discovered in the Vatican archives, where it had lain forgotten for over 400 years. It consisted of 112 cryptic Latin phrases each one purporting to describe a future pope, from Celestine II onward. The phrases assigned to popes before 1590, the year the manuscript was supposedly rediscovered, were remarkably accurate. The phrases assigned to popes after 1590 were increasingly vague and increasingly difficult to match to their supposed subjects. Historians have concluded, with considerable unanimity, that this is not a coincidence. The prophecy of the popes was not written in the 12th century. It was written sometime around 1590 and planted in the archive. The accuracy of the early prophecies was achieved by the straightforward method of writing the descriptions after the fact, a technique so old it has a name. It is called vaticinium ex eventu, prophecy from the event. But what is important for our purposes is not the forgery itself. It is the continuity. The Malachi prophecy was not a new idea. It was the Angelic Pope tradition, the Vaticinia tradition. The Joachimite tradition updated for a new century and a new crisis. In 1590, as in 1294, the Church faced a disputed succession. In 1590, as in 1294, a prophetic text appeared at precisely the moment it was most useful. In 1590, as in 1294, the text pointed with that distinctive combination of apparent precision and convenient ambiguity toward a specific candidate. The candidate in 1590 was Cardinal Girolamo Simoncelli, from the town of Orvieto, which in Latin is Urbs Vetus, the old city. The prophecy's phrase for the next pope after Urban VII was ex antiquitate urbis, from the old city. Simoncelli was not elected, but the mechanism had run, and it would run again and again, because the mechanism does not require the prophecy to be true. It requires only that enough people believe it might be. That is sufficient. That is, in fact, more than sufficient. On a morning in the summer of 1294, a letter left Monte Morone. Wherein this distinction will matter before we are finished, a letter was said to have left Monte Morone. The letter, as it was reported to the conclave at Perugia, carried a warning. Pietro di Morrone, the hermit monk, the founder of the Celestines, the man who had spent 60 years climbing away from the world, had received a divine revelation. God was displeased. The vacancy of the papal throne was a scandal, a negligence, a wound in the body of the Church that was becoming septic. If the cardinals did not act, if they continued to sit in their factions and vote and fail, and adjourn and vote again, the consequences would be severe. Cardinal Latino Orsini rose before the assembly and delivered this message. An Orsini, delivering a message from a hermit, urging the cardinals to abandon their factions and elect a man who stood above all factions. The conclave, 27 months into its failure, voted unanimously. Pietro di Morrone was elected Pope of the Roman Catholic Church on July 5th. Let us pause here. Not to suggest that what happened was simple manipulation, it was not. And we will come to the complexity shortly. But to note what a careful reader of institutions and incentives would notice immediately about this sequence of events. Cardinal Latino Orsini was not a neutral messenger. The Orsini family had been locked in factional combat with the Colonna for the entirety of the conclave. Every candidate they had supported had been blocked. Every compromise they had proposed had been rejected. They were not, by any reasonable assessment, in a position of strength. And yet it was an Orsini cardinal who stood up and said, "A holy man has spoken. The factions must end. There is a candidate above all factions. Let us elect him." This is not, by itself, evidence of anything. Men in desperate situations reach for solutions they would not otherwise consider. an Orsini cardinal, exhausted after 27 months of failure, may have genuinely believed that Pietro di Morrone was the Angelic Pope. The spirituals believed it. Half of Italy believed it. Belief is not the same as cynicism, but belief and cynicism are not mutually exclusive either. The most effective political moves are the ones made by people who have convinced themselves they are not making a political move. The most durable narratives are the ones constructed by people who believe in them. Cardinal Latino Orsini may have been a true believer in Pietro di Morrone's divine appointment. He was also a man whose family stood to benefit considerably from a pope who was politically naive, spiritually focused, and already under the protection of Charles II of Anjou, who was, not coincidentally, the Orsini family's most important ally. We do not know what Latino Orsini believed in his heart. We know what he did. He stood up and ended the conclave. The news spread faster than it should have been possible for news to spread in a world without printing presses or telegraph lines. Within days, the roads of central Italy were full of people moving toward Abruzzo, pilgrims, emotions, noble, clergy, the simply curious, the genuinely devout, all of them drawn by a story that was traveling ahead of them at the speed of rumor and landing with the force of prophecy fulfilled. The hermit king, the holy man from the mountain, the angelic pope. Finally, after all the waiting and all the corruption and all the interminable vacancy, he had been elected. He was real. The prophecy was true. By the time Pietro di Morrone descended his mountain to be crowned, 200,000 people had gathered to witness it. 200,000. In a world where most people live their entire lives within a day's walk of their birthplace, where the largest cities in Italy contained perhaps 80,000 inhabitants, where travel was slow and dangerous and expensive, 200,000 people had moved, in the space of days, to stand in the presence of a man they had never seen, to witness an event whose significance they understood entirely in prophetic terms. This was not simply enthusiasm. This was a population responding to a narrative that had been in construction for decades, that explained the present moment in terms of a divine plan, that gave the chaos and corruption and vacancy of the past 2 years a meaning that mere politics could not provide. The angelic Pope had come. History was moving in the right direction after all. Here is what Pietro di Morrone did when the delegation of soldiers and church officials climbed his mountain to inform him of his election. He wept. He prayed. He resisted briefly, genuinely, in the manner of a man who understood at the level of bone and long experience, and this was not something he was equipped for. And then he said, "I accept." 2 words that changed the history of the church. Not because Pietro di Morrone wanted power, not because he was deceived about what awaited him. He was 84 years old. He had spent 67 years inside a religious order, watching how institutions worked, watching how the men who led them were shaped and compromised and consumed by the forces they thought they were directing. He was not naive about power in the way that the people who elected him needed him to be. He accepted because he believed in the same way he believed everything, with the simple, total conviction of a man who has reduced his life to its essential elements, that if God had arranged for him to be elected, then refusing the election was refusing God. This is the cruelty at the center of the story. Pietro di Morrone was trapped not by force but by faith. The same faith that had made him the perfect candidate, the faith that had kept him on that mountain, poor and humble and genuinely holy. For 60 years was the faith that made it impossible for him to refuse what was being done to him in faith's name. He could not say, "I am being used," because to say that would be to say that God does not direct history. And he believed, completely and without reservation, that God directs history. The trap was elegant. It did not require anyone to force him. It only required the right man to be presented with the right narrative at the right moment. Faith did the rest. He descended the mountain. He rode a donkey in conscious imitation of Christ's entry into Jerusalem, an iconographic choice that the crowds immediately recognized and interpreted, and the 200,000 who had gathered to see him responded with the kind of collective emotion that turns individuals into movements. The coronation was held not in Rome, not in the Basilica of St. Peter, where popes had been crowned for centuries, but in L'Aquila, in the basilica that Pietro himself had built a decade earlier. This was, ostensibly, a concession to his age and his discomfort with travel. It was also, whether or not anyone intended it this way, a statement. The Angelic Pope would not be crowned in the corrupt center of ecclesiastical power. He would be crowned in a place that belonged to him, that he had built, that was outside the machinery of Rome. The symbolism was perfect. The reality was already beginning to diverge from the symbolism. King Charles II of Naples was one of the first men to arrive at Pietro di Morrone's mountain after the election. This requires attention. Charles II was not there by accident. He was not there out of simple piety. Though piety was certainly available as an explanation, he was there because Pietro di Morrone was, in a very specific and very practical sense, the Celestine Order, Pietro's order. The institutional base he had built over 40 years operated under the protection of the Angevin crown. Charles I, Charles II's father, had been the order's royal patron. The relationship was not merely spiritual. The Celestines held lands and privileges that existed within the Angevin sphere of influence. Pietro di Morrone was, in the vocabulary of medieval political relationships, a client of the Angevins. Not a corrupt client, not a man who had traded his holiness for political protection, but a client nonetheless. The relationship was real. It had real consequences. And Charles II understood those consequences better than Pietro did. When Charles II arrived at Monte Moroni and presented his homage to the new pope, he was doing something that looked like devotion and functioned like a claim. He was establishing, publicly and before witnesses, that the Angelic Pope was his. The subsequent decisions of Celestine V's pontificate become considerably more comprehensible once this relationship is understood. Pietro di Morrone was not simply a holy man out of his depth in a political world. He was a holy man out of his depth in a political world, surrounded by people who had very specific interests in his decisions, operating within a court that had been relocated at Charles's urging from Rome to Naples, the center of Angevin power. Rome, the actual seat of the papacy, the city where the administrative machinery of the church was located, was 400 kilometers away. Naples was right there, and Charles II was right there with it. The cardinals who had elected Pietro di Morrone were not, for the most part, idealists. They were practical men who had spent 27 months in a failed conclave and had reached for the only solution available. Now, having reached for it, they watched what was emerging from their decision with a mixture of relief and growing alarm. The relief was genuine. The vacancy was over. The scandal of the empty throne had ended. The political crisis that a leaderless church had created, the disputed territories, the unresolved appeals, the emboldened enemies could now begin to be addressed. The alarm was also genuine, because Pietro di Morrone, Celestine V, as he was now, was doing things that popes did not do, not because he was corrupt or malicious, because he genuinely did not understand the implications of what he was doing, because he had spent 67 years inside a monastery and had no framework for the kind of decisions he was now required to make. He issued privileges with a generosity that bordered on chaos. He granted indulgences to anyone who visited his basilica in L'Aquila on specific feast days, a decision that was self-serving in the technical sense without being self-serving in any sense Pietro would have recognized. He granted the same position to multiple competing petitioners, without apparently understanding that a position could only be held by one person at a time. He created 12 new cardinals, the number of the apostles, a choice that had obvious prophetic resonance and immediate political consequences. 7 of those 12 cardinals were French. 7 of 12, in a college of cardinals whose composition would determine the next papal election. Celestine V had, in a single decision, created a French majority. Whether this was Charles II's suggestion, or the Orsinis's, or simply Pietro's own instinct toward men whose language he knew better than Roman Italian, the effect was the same. The next conclave would be shaped by what Celestine V did in these 5 months. The next conclave would produce Clement V. Clement V would move the papacy to Avignon. The papacy would remain in Avignon for 70 years. The Avignon papacy would produce the Great Schism, the period when the Church had 2, and then 3, competing claimants to the papal throne simultaneously. All of this began with 12 cardinals appointed by a man who thought he was being generous. The road to catastrophe is rarely marked. It is paved with decisions that made perfect sense to the person making them, decisions made in good faith, within a framework that felt true and right and divinely sanctioned, by a man who had spent 67 years becoming exactly holy enough to be used. The cardinals began to discuss, privately, whether it was possible for a pope to resign. This was not a simple question. It had never happened, or rather, it had happened once, long ago, in circumstances so different that the precedent was disputed. The legal question was genuinely uncertain. If a pope was the vicar of Christ on earth, appointed by divine authority, could he simply stop? Could divine appointment be returned? Celestine V, characteristically, resolved the question himself. He consulted canon lawyers. He issued a decree, one of the very few of his official acts that was not subsequently annulled by his successor, establishing formally and permanently that a pope had the right to resign. Then he used it. On December 13th, 1826, 5 months and 8 days after his coronation in L'Aquila, Celestine V appeared before the assembled cardinals, removed his papal robes, and resumed the simple habit of a Celestine monk. He had been pope for 5 months. He had fulfilled the Angelic Pope prophecy, or rather, the prophecy had been fulfilled through him, and the world had not been transformed. The age of the Spirit had not begun. The corrupt institutional church had not been reformed. The spirituals who had proclaimed his election as the dawn of a new era watched the dawn extinguish itself in the gray December air of Naples. The prophecy had failed. Or, and this is the more interesting interpretation, the prophecy had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had produced a pope, a specific pope, a weak pope, a pope who would make specific decisions, 12 cardinals, a French majority, an Avignon tendency that would shape the church for the next century, a pope whose resignation would hand the throne to a man who was, in almost every respect, his opposite. That man was waiting in the wings. He had been waiting, patient and deliberate, for 5 months. His name was Benedetto Caetani. The world would know him as Boniface VIII, and what Boniface VIII would do with the papacy that Celestine V had vacated, what he would build, what he would claim, what wars he would start and what humiliations he would suffer and what legacy he would leave is a story for another day. What matters, for our purposes, is what he did first. Within weeks of his election, Boniface VIII issued an order for the arrest of Pietro di Morrone, the holy man, the hermit, The man who had asked for nothing except to be left alone with his God and his silence. The man who had wept when he was elected, and who was now, at 84 years old, attempting to walk back to his mountain. Boniface VIII had him captured. Pietro had tried to flee, had reached the Adriatic coast before being found and imprisoned in the castle of Fumone, in the hills south of Rome. The castle was described by contemporaries as narrow, uncomfortable, cold. Pietro di Morrone lived there for 10 months. He died on May 19th. Eaten down by Tushlo. His last words, according to those who were with him, were from the 31st Psalm. Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. Boniface VIII was not with him. Boniface VIII was in Rome, consolidating power, fighting with the Colonna, preparing the legal and theological arguments for a claim to papal authority so absolute that it would eventually drive him into direct conflict with the King of France, a conflict that would end in 1303, with French agents breaking into his private chambers at Anagni and striking him across the face. The Anagni slap, as it is known to history, the moment when the most powerful pope of the medieval world was physically assaulted by the agents of the French crown in his own home, and the papacy never fully recovered its authority. But before any of that happened, before Boniface VIII's story reached its own catastrophic conclusion, the story of the man he had imprisoned was already being rewritten. The spirituals who had proclaimed Pietro di Morrone the Angelic Pope did not abandon him when he resigned. They abandoned the argument that his resignation had been voluntary. They argued, instead, that Celestine had been manipulated, coerced, forced from the throne by the corrupt forces he had been sent to reform. They argued that Boniface VIII's election was therefore invalid. They argued that the church had been stolen. This argument did not change anything immediately, but it established a template. The Angelic Pope had been real. He had come. He had been defeated by the same corruption he was meant to cleanse. The prophecy had not failed. It had been suppressed. Therefore, the prophecy was still coming. The age of the Spirit was still ahead. All you had to do was wait. All you had to do was watch for the next sign. This is how prophetic traditions survive their failures. Not by admitting the failure, by explaining it, by incorporating the failure into the narrative as evidence of the resistance that any true prophecy must overcome. The prophecy does not fail. The prophecy is opposed, and its opposition is itself proof of its truth. Celestine V was canonized in 1313, 19 years after his death, by Pope Clement V. In Avignon, the city that his 12 cardinals had made possible, the Angelic Pope, declared a saint. The mechanism, still running. There is a particular kind of disaster that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with fire or collapse or the sound of walls coming down. It arrives quietly, in the form of decisions that seem reasonable at the time, decisions made by people who are doing their best, within a framework they believe in, toward goals they consider righteous. It accumulates, it compounds, and by the time it becomes visible as disaster, the decisions that produced it are already weeks or months or years in the past, and the people who made them are either gone or unable to understand what they did wrong, because from inside the framework, everything they did was right. This is the kind of disaster that Celestine V's 5-month pontificate was, not a catastrophe of malice, a catastrophe of misalignment between the man and the role, between the prophecy and the reality, between what the institution needed and what the institution had chosen. To understand it fully, you need to understand what a pope actually did in the 13th century. The medieval papacy was not primarily a spiritual office with some political inconveniences attached. It was a political institution with a spiritual mandate, and the political dimensions of the office had been expanding. continuously and deliberately, for over 200 years before Pietro di Morrone descended his mountain in the summer of 1294. By the end of the 13th century, the papacy controlled a significant territorial state in central Italy. The papal states with all the administrative complexity that territorial sovereignty implied. It maintained a court, a bureaucracy, a legal system, and a diplomatic apparatus that negotiated with every major power in Europe. It collected taxes from the entire Western Church. It heard appeals from ecclesiastical courts across the continent. It issued legal documents, bulls, decrees, rescripts that had the force of law in every Catholic country. It was, in short, a government, and governing it required not holiness, or not only holiness but the specific, technical, deeply unglamorous competence of administration, the ability to evaluate competing legal claims, the ability to manage a bureaucracy without either micromanaging it into paralysis or releasing it into corruption, the ability to negotiate to understand what your counterpart wanted, what you could give, what you could not give, and how to reach an agreement that both parties could live with. Pietro di Morrone had none of these skills. This was not his fault. He had spent 67 years inside a monastery, and the skills that a monastery required: discipline, prayer, the management of a small community of monks, the cultivation of an interior life were not the skills that the papacy required. He was not unintelligent. He was not incompetent in any absolute sense. He was simply a man who had been trained over an entire lifetime for a completely different job, and then placed without warning or preparation into one of the most complex administrative and political positions in the Western world. The results were predictable. They were also, in their specific details, consequential in ways that extended far beyond the 5 months of his pontificate. The first problem was geography. Celestine V was crowned in L'Aquila on August 29th. He did not go to Rome. This was, on the surface, understandable. He was 84 years old. Rome was 400 kilometers away. The journey would have been arduous, and Charles II of Naples, whose kingdom surrounded L'Aquila and whose influence over the new pope was already extensive, had strong reasons to prefer that the papal court remain in his territory rather than relocating to Rome, where it would have been subject to different political pressures and considerably further from Angevin control. So the papal court went to Naples instead, and in Naples in the Castel Nuovo, the great Angevin fortress overlooking the Bay of Naples, Celestine V took up residence. He had a small cell built within the castle, modeled on his hermit's hut in the Abruzzo Mountains. He spent as much time as possible in prayer. He was, by all accounts, deeply uncomfortable with everything around him. The cardinals were also uncomfortable, because the machinery of the papal government, the curia, the chancery, the legal apparatus, the administrative staff was not in Naples. It was in Rome, and running the government of the Western Church from a small cell in a Neapolitan castle, at a remove of 400 kilometers from the city where the government actually functioned, while a French-trained king managed access to the Pope and controlled the physical space in which he lived, was not a sustainable arrangement. It was, however, an extremely convenient arrangement for Charles II of Naples. The second problem was the granting of privileges. Pietro di Morrone had spent his life as the head of a religious order. In that role, granting permissions and exemptions and accommodations to the members of his community was a normal, daily function. It was personal. It was manageable. It was conducted within a community small enough that he could know, roughly, what permissions had been granted and to whom. The papacy operated at a different scale. Petitioners came from across Europe. They came with specific requests, benefices, indulgences, exemptions, appointments to church positions, and they came with the expectations of people who understood that access to a pope was limited, and time was short, and if you did not secure what you needed now, you might not get another opportunity. Celestine V, who could refuse no one, granted what they asked. All of them. This produced a situation that the cardinals described in terms that combined outrage with a kind of exhausted disbelief as chaos. The same church position was granted to multiple petitioners simultaneously. Indulgences were issued with a generosity that the treasury of the church could not support. Permissions were extended and then, inadvertently, extended again to someone else, creating conflicting claims that would require years of litigation to resolve. The papal chancery, the office responsible for actually drafting and issuing these documents, was overwhelmed. Documents were produced with errors. Procedures were skipped. The legal standards that made papal documents valid were applied inconsistently, creating vulnerabilities that would later be exploited by those who wanted to challenge the legitimacy of acts performed under Celestine's authority. When Boniface VIII annulled the majority of Celestine V's official acts after the resignation, he did not do so purely out of political motivation, though political motivation was certainly present. He did so because many of those acts were genuinely incoherent. They contradicted each other. They contradicted established law. They had been issued by a man who did not understand the legal framework within which he was operating. Two petitioners who had exploited that ignorance with varying degrees of deliberateness. The administration of the Western Church had, in 5 months, accumulated a backlog of legal problems that would take years to resolve. The third problem, the one with the longest consequences, was the cardinals. On September 18th, 1294, 40 days after his coronation, Celestine V created 12 new cardinals. 12, the number of the apostles. The symbolism was deliberate and unmistakable. This was not an administrative decision. This was a theological statement, an assertion that the College of Cardinals was being renewed, returned to its original number, restored to its apostolic foundation. The theology was sincere. The politics were catastrophic. Of the 12 new cardinals, 7 were French. This was not random. The French candidates had been recommended, or more precisely, had been arranged by Charles II of Naples, whose own political interests were closely aligned with the French crown. Charles was the son of Charles I, who had been the brother of King Louis IX of France. The Angevin dynasty that ruled Naples was French in origin, French in culture, and French in its political allegiances. A French-majority College of Cardinals was a College of Cardinals that would, in the next election, be considerably more likely to produce a pope favorable to French interests. The cardinals, who had spent 27 months in conclave to prevent exactly this kind of factional manipulation, watched it happen and could do nothing. Celestine V had the authority to appoint cardinals. He had used it. The appointments were made. The college was changed, and when Celestine V resigned 3 months later, and the cardinals assembled for the next conclave, those 7 French cardinals were there. And when that conclave produced Clement V, a Frenchman, the first of the Avignon popes, those 7 votes were part of the majority. And when Clement V moved the papacy to Avignon in 1309 to France, to the city that would house the papal court for 70 years, the decision that made it possible had been made by an 84-year-old hermit in Naples who thought he was being generous. The Avignon papacy lasted from 1309 to 1377. During those 70 years, all 7 popes were French. The papacy was widely perceived, across Europe, as an instrument of French royal policy, a perception that damaged the Church's authority in ways that took centuries to repair. The conflict between the Avignon papacy and the Roman nobility produced the Western Schism, the period from 1378 to 1417, during which there were two, and eventually three, simultaneous claimants to the papal throne, each excommunicating the others, each claiming to be the legitimate successor of St. Peter. The Western Schism was the most serious institutional crisis the Church had faced since the Great Schism of 1054. It shook the foundations of papal authority in ways that would not be fully resolved until the Council of Constance in 1417, and even then, the resolution left scars that would contribute, a century later, to the conditions from which the Protestant Reformation emerged. All of this, the Avignon papacy, the Western Schism, the crisis of papal authority that contributed to the Reformation, has roots that run through a chain of specific decisions and specific consequences. Back to a September morning in 1294, when an 84-year-old hermit appointed 12 cardinals because the number 12 had apostolic significance. This is how history actually works. Not through the grand gestures of world historical figures making conscious choices to reshape the future, through the accumulation of small decisions, each one reasonable within its immediate context, each one carrying consequences that extend far beyond what any individual decision-maker could perceive. By November of 1294, the cardinals were no longer discussing the situation in private. They were discussing it with Celestine V directly. These conversations, as they have been reconstructed from contemporary accounts, had the quality of a particular kind of painful honesty, the kind that occurs when people who have been maintaining a polite fiction can no longer maintain it, and must say, carefully and with as much diplomatic cushioning as possible, that the fiction has ceased to be sustainable. The message was not delivered cruelly. It was delivered with the awareness that Pietro di Morrone was, by any measure, a genuinely holy man, a man who had dedicated his life to God in a way that most of the men delivering the message had not. The cardinals who came to him in November 1294 were not bad men exposing a fraud. They were practical men confronting a mismatch. The holy man was not wrong to be holy. The institution was not wrong to need competence. The tragedy was that both things were true simultaneously, and there was no resolution that honored both. Celestine V had been thinking about resignation for weeks before these conversations. His own discomfort with the role, with the noise, the pressure, the constant stream of petitioners, the administrative demands, the political maneuvering happening around him and through him had been evident from the first days of his pontificate. He had, according to several sources, seriously considered simply abandoning the papacy and returning to his mountain. Not resigning formally, there was no clear legal mechanism for formal resignation, but simply walking away. It was this impulse, the impulse of a man who had spent his life walking away from power, that led him to commission the legal opinion on whether a pope could resign. The lawyers told him yes. Or rather, they told him that the question was uncertain, but that there was a plausible legal argument for yes. For Celestine V, plausible was enough. He was not looking for permission. He was looking for cover, the assurance that what he felt compelled to do would not be a sin. That returning to his mountain, to his silence and his prayer and the life he understood, was not a betrayal of the office God had placed him in, but a recognition of his own limitations, an act not of cowardice, but of responsibility. He issued the decree on December 10th, Etienne Lambagiorgese, establishing formally that a pope had the right to resign. 3 days later, on December 13th, he used it. The scene in the Great Hall of the Castel Nuovo was described by those who witnessed it as extraordinary in its simplicity. There was no drama. There was no anguish. Celestine V appeared before the assembled cardinals in his full pontifical robes. Read a prepared statement citing his desire to return to a humble life. His age, his ignorance, his physical weakness, and the peace of his former life, and then remove the papal vestments, piece by piece, and set them aside. Underneath, he was wearing the rough habit of a Celestine monk. He sat down. He was no longer Pope. The cardinals sat in silence for a moment. Then the business of arranging the next conclave began. Benedetto Caetani had been watching. He had been watching for 5 months, watching the privileges cascade out of control, watching the cardinals grow increasingly alarmed, watching Charles II's hand move the pieces around the board with the confidence of a man who knew the game far better than his opponent. He had been in the room, or close to the room, for most of what had happened. He was a lawyer. Specifically, he was one of the most accomplished canon lawyers in Europe, a man who understood the legal architecture of the church with the precision of an engineer who has spent decades studying a structure and identified exactly where the load-bearing walls are and exactly where the weaknesses lie. He had been a cardinal since 1281. He was 63 years old. He was not holy in the way that Pietro di Morrone was holy. He was not poor, not humble, not particularly given to prayer as a primary activity. He was intelligent, ambitious, politically skilled, and possessed of a conception of papal authority so expansive that it would eventually produce the most sweeping claims to temporal power that any pope had ever made. He was also, by almost every account of people who interacted with him, difficult, proud, quick to take offense, capable of a vindictiveness that was remarkable even by the standards of medieval ecclesiastical politics. He needed only 17 days. The conclave opened on December 23rd and closed on December 24th. Benedetto Caetani was elected Pope on Christmas Eve, a piece of timing so symbolically resonant that it is difficult to believe it was purely accidental. He took the name Boniface VIII. His first significant act as Pope was to issue a bull confirming the validity of Celestine V's resignation and his own election, a legal formality that was, simultaneously, a political statement. The question is settled. The abdication was valid. The election was valid. There is no ambiguity. No opening for challenge. No space for the spirituals to argue that the rightful Pope was still alive and living in a monastery somewhere. His second significant act was to order the arrest of Pietro di Morrone. Pietro had not waited to see what Boniface would do. He had left Naples almost immediately after his resignation, moving north and east, back toward his mountain, back toward the silence and the prayer and the life he had been trying to return to for 5 months. He moved faster than a man of 84 years could comfortably move. He reached the Adriatic coast. He found a boat. He may have been trying to reach Greece. There are accounts suggesting he hoped to find a monastery there, far enough from Italy that the politics of the papacy could not reach him. Boniface VIII's agents were faster. They caught him on the Adriatic coast and brought him back. He was held, initially, in various locations, moved from place to place, with the restless deliberateness of a government managing an asset it finds inconvenient. Eventually, he was installed in the castle of Fumone, in the hills of Lazio, southeast of Rome. Fumone was described by those who visited it as a bleak place, cold in winter. The cell in which Pietro lived was small. He was treated, according to contemporaries, with a kind of formal dignity that carefully avoided being actual comfort. He was not physically mistreated or not in ways that could be documented, but he was imprisoned. And he was old, and the castle was cold, and the cell was small, and he had been, for the last 5 months, subjected to a level of stress and exhaustion that would have broken most people a third of his age. He lived for 10 months. He died on May 19th. Eaten down by Joselo. The rumors began almost immediately. Boniface VIII had murdered him, had him killed. The nail through the skull, a story that circulated widely enough to be referenced 2 centuries later, and that Dan Brown would eventually incorporate into a thriller. And that modern examination of Celestine's remains has found no evidence to support. But the rumor did not require evidence. It required only the combination of a suspicious death, a politically motivated imprisonment, and a successor whose character was well enough known that murder seemed, to many people, entirely plausible. Boniface VIII neither confirmed nor denied. He did not need to. He had the throne. He had the legal arguments. He had the French cardinals and the Angevin alliance and the administrative machinery of the church. He had everything Pietro di Morrone had never wanted and never sought. And Pietro di Morrone had what Boniface VIII could not take from him, and could not manufacture for himself, and would spend his entire pontificate trying unsuccessfully to claim the love of the people. The spirituals who had proclaimed Pietro the Angelic Pope did not forget him. They could not canonize him. That power belonged to his successor, but they kept his memory. And they kept the argument that his resignation had been coerced. And they kept the claim that Boniface VIII's election was therefore invalid. They lost. Politically. They always lost. Politically. But they kept the record. And they kept waiting for the next sign. Dante Alighieri was 30 years old when Celestine V resigned. He was 32 when Pietro di Morrone died in Fumone. He was in the middle of his political career still, a citizen of Florence in good standing. Still years away from the exile that would give him the time and the motive to write the work for which he would be remembered forever. When he wrote the Commedia, when he descended in imagination through the architecture of hell, he placed Celestine V at the entrance, not deep inside, not in the circles reserved for the actively wicked, but at the threshold, in the vestibule, the place for those who had refused commitment, who had been given a great choice and declined to make it. He described him, famously, only by a shadow, a shade of the one who made the great refusal. Colui che fece per viltà del gran rifiuto. He who made through cowardice the great refusal. Dante was not generous to Celestine V. He did not see a holy man trapped by faith and circumstance and the political machinery of more sophisticated men. He saw a man who had been given a chance to reform the church and had walked away from it. The interpretation is harsh. It may also be wrong. The evidence suggests that Celestine V's pontificate, had it continued, would not have reformed the church but accelerated its deterioration, and that his resignation, however it was arrived at, may have been the most genuinely responsible decision of his pontificate. But Dante's harshness towards Celestine makes his treatment of Boniface VIII all the more striking, because Boniface VIII, Dante placed not at the gates of hell, but in the 8th circle, deep inside, in the Bolgia reserved for the Simonists, those who sold and bought holy offices, who treated the sacred as a commodity, the popes who had corrupted the church for personal gain. Dante has a character encounter. The Simonist before Boniface VIII is actually dead. Boniface was still alive when Dante was supposedly making his imaginary journey, and the character of Pope Nicholas III, already buried upside down in a hole with his feet on fire in the manner of the Simonists, mistakes Dante's guide for Boniface, because Boniface is so confidently expected to arrive that his place is already reserved. Are you standing there already? Boniface? Already there. His place already waiting. His damnation so certain that it preceded his death. Dante was not a subtle writer. He was a precise one. The juxtaposition was intentional. The man at the gates, who had made the great refusal, and the man in the eighth circle, who had seized what the first man refused and used it as simonists use holy things. Between them, the papacy of 1294, vacancy, the prophecy, the election, the disaster, and the mechanism that had produced all of it. Still running. In the spring of 2013, Pope Benedict XVI became the first pope in nearly 600 years to resign. He made the announcement on a Monday morning in February, reading a brief statement in Latin before a small gathering of cardinals. His voice was steady. The room was not. Within hours, the news had reached every corner of the world, not in the way news traveled in 1294, carried by riders on horseback along roads that dissolved into mud beneath the winter rain, but instantaneously, simultaneously, in every language, to every screen, to every person with a device in their pocket and a connection to the network that now carried the nervous system of the species. Benedict's resignation on February 11, 2013 shocked the Catholic world and was immediately recognized as the first papal resignation since the early 15th century. And within hours of that announcement, within hours, the prophecy of the popes was everywhere. Not in obscure theological journals, not in specialized publications of Catholic scholarship. Everywhere. Mainstream news outlets, social media, comment section, video channels. The prophecy attributed to Saint Malachy, the 12th century Irish archbishop, to whom a list of 112 cryptic Latin phrases had long been attached, suddenly escaped the margins and entered mass culture. A text that most serious historians regarded as a late forgery, likely emerging in the 16th century, was now being discussed with urgency by millions of people who had never heard of it before. Because according to the prophecy, Benedict XVI was number 111, and number 112 the final pope, the one whose reign was said to precede the destruction of Rome and the Last Judgment, was named only in the closing line as Petrus Romanus, Peter the Roman. Benedict had resigned. A conclave would meet. A new pope would be chosen. And to millions of people, it meant something more than succession. It meant culmination. It meant the end was approaching. This is what millions of people were saying in February 2013. On the internet. In the most technologically sophisticated civilization in human history. They were saying it about a document almost certainly fabricated centuries after the death of the saint to whom it was attributed. And they were saying it in the same news cycle that produced one of the most unforgettable images of Benedict's resignation. Lightning, striking the dome of Sante, Peter's Basilica, only hours after the announcement. The photograph spread across the world almost instantly. To some, it was only weather. To others, it felt like a sign. That distinction hardly mattered. What mattered was how quickly modern people, surrounded by systems of astonishing technological power, still reverted to the oldest grammar of meaning when authority faltered and history seemed to tremble. On the day of Benedict's announcement, widely circulated reporting and photography captured lightning striking St. Peter's Basilica, and the image was immediately framed by many observers as an omen. The medium had changed. The mechanism had not. This is the thing that the history of the Angelic Pope prophecy from Joachim of Fiore to the Vaticinia de Summis Pontificibus to Celestine V to the Malachy forgery to Benedict XVI's resignation, this is the thing that history is trying to tell us, if we are willing to listen to it without the comfortable assumption that we are different from the people who came before us. The mechanism does not require ignorance. It does not require the absence of critical thinking. It does not require a pre-scientific worldview, or illiteracy, or the absence of access to information. The cardinals of the 13th century were, within the framework available to them, some of the most educated men in Europe. The theologians who debated the authenticity of the Malachi prophecy in the 16th century were doing so with tools of textual criticism that were genuinely sophisticated. The people who shared the Malachi prophecy in 2013 had access, with a few keystrokes, to every serious historical assessment of its authenticity. They shared it anyway, because the mechanism does not operate through ignorance, it operates through need. Let us be precise about what the mechanism is, because it has been running for so long, in so many different forms, that it is easy to mistake the container for the contents to think that the mechanism is the specific prophecy, or the specific institution, or the specific historical moment. It is not. The mechanism is this: when a system is in crisis, when the normal processes by which decisions are made have failed, when the people who are supposed to be in charge cannot agree, when the vacancy at the center of things has gone on long enough that people are beginning to doubt whether the center will ever be filled again, a particular kind of narrative becomes available. The narrative says, this is not chaos. This is preparation. The crisis is not a failure of the system. It is the labor pain that precedes the birth of something new. There is a figure coming, or already present, already among us, who will resolve the crisis not through the normal mechanisms of politics and negotiation and compromise, but through a quality of being that stands above those mechanisms, a holiness, a purity, a divine appointment that bypasses the corrupt processes that have failed and goes directly to the source of authority itself. The narrative is always slightly vague about this figure's specific policies. It is never vague about their character. They will be humble. They will be outside the system. They will be untouched by the corruptions that have made the system fail. They are already written. They are already chosen. All you have to do is recognize them. This narrative is effective for reasons that have nothing to do with its truth or falsehood. It is effective because it transforms the intolerable experience of institutional failure, the anxiety, the uncertainty, the sense that the people in charge do not know what they are doing and cannot be trusted, into the tolerable, even exciting experience of prophetic fulfillment. The crisis is not frightening. It is meaningful. The vacancy is not a failure. It is a sign. You are not living through a collapse. You are living through a transition. And the specific content of the prophecy, the specific phrases, the specific imagery, the specific figure identified as the fulfillment is almost secondary to this primary function. The prophecy's job is not to accurately predict the future. Its job is to reframe the present, to take the chaos of now and place it inside a narrative that makes the chaos bearable, that gives it direction, that transforms the experience of being lost into the experience of being on the way. Pietro di Morrone did not know he was part of a mechanism. This is the most important thing to understand about him, and the thing that is most easily lost in the telling of this story. He was a genuinely holy man. The evidence for this is not hagiographic, not the accounts written by his followers after his death, not the miracles attributed to his tomb, not the canonization by Clement V in 1313. The evidence is in the structure of his life. 67 years of genuine poverty, a consistent pattern of retreating from power rather than seeking it, the tears when he heard of his election, the resignation that no one expected and that he had no personal incentive to make, the walk back toward his mountain at 84 years old, after 5 months that had cost him everything. He did not want to be the Angelic Pope. He did not claim to be the Angelic Pope. He had spent his entire life trying to be something considerably more modest: a monk, a hermit, a man who had made the calculation that the most useful thing he could do with his time on earth was to remove himself from the processes that produce Angelic Pope narratives and simply be quiet and pray. The irony is absolute. The qualities that made him the perfect candidate for the Angelic Pope prophecy, were the qualities he had cultivated precisely in order to have nothing to do with Angelic Pope prophecies. His holiness was genuine. His poverty was genuine. His distance from the political world was genuine. And it was precisely because these things were genuine that they were useful, that they could be fitted around him like a costume he had never agreed to wear, and presented to 200,000 people as the fulfillment of a century-long expectation. A fabricated holy man would not have worked. The crowds could tell. The spirituals could tell. The cardinals who voted for him could tell. What made the mechanism work was that the man at its center was real. The lie was not Pietro di Morrone. The lie was the framework that was placed around him. There is a question that this story raises and does not answer. Because it cannot answer it, because it is the kind of question that each generation must answer for itself, with the tools available to it and within the constraints of its particular moment. The question is, how do you recognize the mechanism when you are inside it? Not in retrospect. Retrospect is easy. Looking back at 1294. Ora to mia 590. Ora 2013. The mechanism is visible. The prophecy was forged. The election was shaped by interests that had nothing to do with holiness. The sharing of the Malachi prophecy on social media was a demonstration of how quickly a 600-year-old forgery could travel when people were frightened and the moment felt significant. All of this is clear in retrospect. But the cardinals of 1294 were not living in retrospect. They were living in the 27th month of a failed conclave. In the Italian summer, with colleagues dying around them, watching the church deteriorate without a leader. The spirituals who proclaimed Pietro, the Angelic Pope, were not cynics performing a useful fiction. They were believers responding to what appeared to them, in real time, as genuine evidence of prophetic fulfillment. The people who shared the Malachi prophecy in 2013 were not idiots. They were people experiencing, in real time, a moment that felt significant, and reaching for the framework that made the significance legible. The mechanism works not because it deceives people who would otherwise see clearly. It works because it answers a genuine need, the need for meaning in chaos, the need for narrative in crisis, the need to believe that the vacancy at the center of things is temporary and purposeful rather than permanent and meaningless. And here is the terrible corollary. The mechanism does not care whether the need is genuine. The need is always genuine. The crisis is always real. The vacancy is always painful. And the narrative that fills the vacancy, the prophecy, the chosen figure, the assurance that history is moving in the right direction after all, is always, on some level, a construction. A story placed over the reality to make the reality bearable. The question is not whether the story is comforting. It is whether this story is true. And the question after that, the harder one, is what happens to the people who are placed at the center of the story without being asked. Pietro di Morrone is buried in the Basilica of Santa Maria di Collemaggio. In L'Aquila, the church he built himself. In the city where he was crowned. The building was damaged in the earthquake of 2009. His remains survived. This was widely reported as a miracle. Boniface VIII is buried in St. Peter's Basilica, in a tomb that was moved and reconstructed several times and is no longer clearly locatable within the structure. His epitaph described him as the greatest of popes. Dante described him differently. The conclave of 2013 produced Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, who took the name Francis. He was the first Jesuit pope, the first pope from the Americas, the first pope to take the name Francis in the history of the Church. He was not the last pope. The prophecy was wrong, as it had always been wrong, as it had been designed, from the beginning, not to be right, because a prophecy that is right eventually stops being useful. and a prophecy that is never quite right can be reinterpreted endlessly to remain perpetually relevant. Ex antiquitate urbis, from the old city, Cardinal Simoncelli, from Orvieto. He was not elected. The prophecy was reinterpreted. The phrase applied to someone else. The mechanism continued. After Francis was elected, the people who had been sharing the Malachi prophecy online for the previous week, the people who had been explaining to each other that the end was near, that number 112 was coming, that the prophecy was being fulfilled, began to reinterpret. Bergoglio's middle name contained a reference to Peter. They said, or his parents were Roman. Metaphorically, or the prophecy described his pontificate rather than his identity. Or the translation of Petrus Romanus needed to be reconsidered. The mechanism continued. It is continuing now. What Pietro di Morrone understood, sitting in his cave on Monte Morone, that the people who elected him did not what he had understood for 67 years of silence and prayer and deliberate retreat from the world was something very simple. He understood that the gap between what an institution needs and what a holy person can provide is not a problem that prophecy can solve. Holiness is not administration. Purity is not governance. Spiritual authenticity is not the same as political competence. And the qualities that make a man a saint are not the qualities that make an institution function. The Angelic Pope was always going to fail. Not because the man was not holy, he was. Not because the need was not genuine, it was. But because the problem that produced the 27-month vacancy was a structural problem. A problem of institutional design, of factional balance, of the relationship between the church and the secular powers of Europe, and structural problems cannot be solved by the arrival of a sufficiently holy person. They can only be addressed by the hard, slow, unglamorous work of institutional reform. The prophecy was not a path to reform. It was a path away from reform, a way of believing that the problem had been solved by the election of the right person, so that the structural work of actually solving it could be deferred. This is what makes the Angelic Pope narrative not merely historically interesting, but perpetually relevant. Because the narrative does not belong to the 13th century. It does not belong to medieval Catholicism, or to the specific intersection of Joachimite theology and Franciscan radicalism and Angevin political interest that produced Celestine V. It belongs to every moment of institutional crisis in which the exhausted participants, unable to solve the structural problem through structural means, reach instead for the assurance that the right person is coming. The person who will resolve the crisis simply by being who they are. The person who stands above the system and will therefore not be captured by it. The person who is already written, already chosen. All you have to do is recognize them. We have been reaching for this narrative for a very long time. We are still reaching for it. The mechanism has not changed. Only the medium has. Here is what happened to the people in this story. Celestine V resigned on December 13th. He was imprisoned in the castle of Fumone. He died on May 19th. He was canonized in 1313. He is a saint. Boniface VIII was elected on December 24th. He reigned for nearly 9 years. He issued the bull Unam Sanctam in 1302, the most expansive claim to papal temporal authority ever made, asserting that submission to the Pope was necessary for salvation. He came into direct conflict with King Philip IV of France. In September 1333, French agents, acting on the orders of Philip IV and the Italian nobleman Sciarcolona, broke into Boniface's private chambers in Anagni and confronted him physically. The accounts of what exactly happened vary, whether he was struck, slapped, or merely threatened, but the humiliation was complete and public. Boniface VIII died 1 month later. He is buried somewhere in St. Peter's Basilica. His cause for canonization was never opened. Charles II of Naples continued to rule the Kingdom of Naples until his death in 1309. He outlived the Pope he had managed, and the Pope who had replaced him, and the papacy's residence in Rome. He did not live to see the papacy move to Avignon, though his political maneuvering had helped make it possible. Cardinal Latino Orsini, the man who had stood before the conclave and announced the divine revelation of a holy hermit, did not receive the papacy that the Orsini family had been pursuing for decades. He died in 1296, the same year as Celestine V, without having achieved the goal for which, it is plausible to argue, he had delivered that speech in Perugia 2 years earlier. The spiritual Franciscans continued to argue that Boniface VIII's election was invalid. They were condemned as heretics. Their leaders were burned. Their texts were placed on the index of forbidden books. They lost every political battle they fought. The Angelic Pope prophecy survived. It appeared again in the 14th century, in the 15th, in the 16th, dressed in the vocabulary of a 12th century Irish saint implanted in a Vatican archive, in the 19th, applied to the sequence of modern popes, in the 20th, applied with increasing urgency to each successive pontificate as the number approached 112, in 2013, spread across the internet in the days before the conclave that would elect Francis. It will appear again. It always appears again. Because the mechanism does not require the prophecy to be true. It requires the crisis to be real. And the crisis, the sense that the institutions we depend on are failing. That the people in charge do not know what they are doing. That the vacancy at the center of things is growing rather than closing. This crisis has never really ended. It has only changed its address. Pietro di Morrone sat in his cave and knew something that the crowds below him, 200,000 of them, gathered to witness the fulfillment of a prophecy, did not know. He knew that he was not the answer. He had spent 67 years becoming certain of this. The silence and the prayer and the chain of iron around his body were not the preparation of a man who intended to lead. They were the practice of a man who had understood, at the deepest level available to him, that the problems of the world could not be solved by the arrival of the right person. He wept when the letter came, not from false modesty, not from the performance of humility that powerful men sometimes perform to signal their worthiness for power. He wept because he knew what the letter meant, and he knew what would happen, and he knew that he could not stop it because the faith that had built his certainty also made resistance impossible. The same conviction that told him he was not the answer told him that refusing the call would be refusing God. And Pietro di Morrone did not refuse God, so he descended the mountain, and the world, which had been waiting for its Angelic Pope, got exactly what it had been promised, a holy man, in a role that holiness alone could not fill, surrounded by people who needed him to be something he was not, doing his best. Which was not enough, which was never going to be enough, which everyone who had constructed the narrative around him had known, at some level, was not going to be enough and had chosen him anyway, because the mechanism does not care about the outcome. The mechanism only needs to run. On February 11th, Liang Ling Yishusan, Benedict XVI announced his resignation. By February 12th, the Malachi prophecy had more than 1 million search results. By February 13th, it was on the front page of newspapers in 17 countries. The prophecy that historians had concluded was a 16th century forgery planted in a Vatican archive to influence an election that it did not influence, predicting a sequence of popes with accuracy that dropped from 95% to 8% at the precise moment of its supposed discovery. This prophecy was being discussed, with urgency and sincerity, by millions of people across the world, not because they were ignorant, because the moment felt significant, because the institution felt unstable, because the vacancy, even a vacancy that would last only 46 days, even a vacancy in an age of instant communication and continuous information produced the same anxiety that the vacancy of 1,292 had produced. The same reaching for narrative, the same need to believe that the chaos was purposeful, that the transition was meaningful, that the figure who would emerge from the conclave was not simply the product of 77 cardinals negotiating in a locked room, but something more, something written, something chosen, something that the chaos had been preparing for. All alone, Jorge Mario Bergoglio was elected on March 13th. He took the name Francis. He was not the last pope. He died on April 21st. His successor was elected in May of 2025. The Malachi prophecy was retrieved from its digital archive and circulated again. The mechanism ran as it had run in 1294, when an 84-year-old hermit wept in a cave on a mountain in central Italy and descended, slowly and with great reluctance, toward the crowd of 200,000 people who were waiting to see in him what he knew was not there. The oldest weapon in history has no blade. It has a narrative, and the narrative says, the right person is coming. The crisis will end. The vacancy will be filled. History is moving towards something, and you are on the right side of it. And all you have to do is believe. The narrative has been saying this for 700 years. It is saying it now. The mechanism has not changed. Only the medium has.